We've been talking a lot about the vector drawing tools, but now let's talk about the bitmap tools. Let's start by creating a new bitmap layer on our timeline. We just need to set our art layers to bitmap. So now, since we're working on a bitmap layer, our pencil tool is no longer available to us, and our brush tool has some key differences. Over in the properties palette, you can see it's very similar to what we had before. There's some presets, some key settings, and then down at the bottom, we have the same old options for paint behind and repaint. These work in basically the same way as our vector drawing brushes did. The big difference with the brush tool now is that you have a lot more options for how textured it can be. If you double click the preview, you can see we have a ton of options here for what the tip looks like. If you're used to doing digital painting in Photoshop or another similar program, this is basically the same thing. I can't go over all the ins and outs of how digital painting works, or how customizing brushes work, but I can show you how to import a new brush, because it works a little different than it would in Photoshop. You can just start from what's already here, and then create customized brushes using the options available here with these sliders. Then you would just hit this button to save it as a new preset. But if you wanted to start from scratch with a totally new tip shape, you click this button, and it's going to want you to look for an image file of a new tip shape. What you want is something that looks like this. Now when you import this, it's going to interpret pure black as completely opaque, and pure white as completely transparent, and the grays in between as semi-transparent. You can create something like this using brushes that already exist in Photoshop or another program. So I'm going to select this file and hit Open. And you can see it now appears on our list as a tip shape option. Again, I then have to define all the parameters here to make it exactly what I want. I also have other options here for combining it with other tip shapes to create even more elaborate effects. And we can add a paper texture effect as well. Not that you can really tell when the brush tip is this textured to begin with. But let's say we like that, and we want to save it, so we can hit this button to add it. We'll call it Custom Brush 1. Now if we select that, you can see that we get a super textured effect when we paint. If you don't want something that elaborate, you've got plenty of more normal options here in your presets. You can just stick with the pencil effect using this tool. That just gives you a basic pencil line. This is mostly what I like to work with when I'm doing sketching. It's a little more natural to work with than the vector pencil tool. So I might do my roughs with the bitmap pencil, and then ink over top of it with the vector pencil. Another tool that's still available to us is this paint bucket tool. We can see in the tool properties window that we have a lot of the same options as the vector version. We can still do paint unpainted, repaint, and unpaint. And we can still adjust our gap tolerance with this setting. However, in the bitmap version, we have this whole section of other options. This option lets you choose which art layer that the paint bucket tool should consider when it's judging what pixels to fill in. These settings define what happens when the paint bucket tool is trying to fill in an area with a fuzzy edge. So for this circle, it's got a nice sharp edge, so when we fill, it's going to fill it pretty nice. For this one, where I used a fuzzier brush, you can see it gives kind of a jagged, fuzzier edge. But if I adjust these settings, it's going to react in different ways. If you're in a situation like this where you're trying to fill something tricky, you're just going to have to play around with these settings to see if you can get it to work. If you're going to be using the paint bucket tool to fill things in, you're going to want really clean line art anyway. So I wouldn't worry too much about these. Our shape drawing tools work the same as the vector versions, except we don't have the polyline option. These can be set up to use any brush that you set up for the paintbrush tool, even the crazy textured ones. The last big difference when drawing with Bitmap tools is that the color palette works different. Unfortunately, with Bitmap drawing, we don't have those nice swappable color swatches. Instead, we have a swatch panel that works more like it does in Photoshop or Illustrator. You can define whatever color you want to use, and then just add it to the list using the plus button. You can still create different palettes to keep your colors organized, though. That's pretty much it for the difference between the vector tools and the Bitmap tools. If you already have some skill with digital painting, and you want to achieve a very specific art style for your animation, then you should definitely try to take advantage of these cool painting tools. If not, I would recommend sticking with the vector tools as much as possible. It's just going to be easier for you going forward. You may see me use Bitmap tools occasionally as we go forward, but for the most part, all of my final artwork is going to be with the vector tools. In the next video, we're going to go over some special effects you can put on your drawings once they're created.